all of that success, where the surge succeeded, we see this all now torn asunder because of a policy of withdrawal without victory. And when those withdrawals and that policy was being orchestrated, the senator from South Carolina and I and others stood up and said, please don't do this. Please leave a small force behind in Iraq. Because the President of the United States declares a conflict over does not mean in the eyes of the enemy that it's over. Conflicts end when the enemy is defeated.
John McCain met the grim news out of Iraq today by doing what John McCain does best, calling for U.S. military force in other places in the world. If only the president had listened to John McCain and prolonged the U.S. military intervention in Iraq. But before you take John McCain's I told you so speech too seriously, I'd take a moment to appreciate some of the other pearls of wisdom he's dispensed on Iraq over the years.
The second phase is Iraq. There is some indication, and I don't have the conclusions, but some of this anthrax may, and I emphasize may, have come from Iraq.
Oh, is that right?
If that may be the case, then that's when some tough decisions are going to have to be made too.
Are you one of those who holds up an optimistic view of the post-war scene? Do you believe that the people of Iraq, or at least a large number of them, will treat us as liberators?
Absolutely. Well, you make a good point as far as the cost of the war is concerned, but since we don't know, because war is so unpredictable, how much that cost is going to be, that's going to be a heavy burden on the American taxpayers. But post-Saddam Hussein Iraq is going to be paid for by the Iraqis. They have billions of dollars of income. They have vast oil reserves. There is not a history of clashes that are violent between Sunnis and Shias. So I think they can probably get along. We're going to win this victory. Tragically, we will lose American lives, but it will be brief. We're going to find out massive evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and we're going to find the incredible brutalities that this dictator has inflicted upon the Iraqi people. And so I think he's going to be justified. I'm confident that he will be justified.
I am confident that all those things that you predict are going to come true, and a lot of people that have been laying out the case against us are going to be very embarrassed.
Joining me now is MSNBC contributor and former Congressman Barney Frank, Democrat from Massachusetts. Congressman, your reaction to the words from Senator John McCain today of "I told you so" regarding Iraq?
First of all, let's be clear. He is there legitimately getting credit for being one of the advocates of the single biggest mistake I believe the American government has ever made at the policy level, the deliberate invasion of Iraq. All of the justifications were false. Weapons of mass destruction. I'd forgotten that they were blaming him for anthrax. The Shia and Sunni getting together. They were completely wrong. Secondly, I have a kind of an initial point that Lindsey Graham and John McCain and the others ought to take. If they are going to want us to send more military involvement into Iraq, they'll want to stay in Afghanistan far longer than the president wants to. They want to get involved militarily in Syria. They think we didn't do enough in Libya. Where are they going to pay for this? These are people who, in other guises, talk about how terrible the deficit is. So let's be very clear to this whole section of Republicans. This notion that they're worried about the deficit goes out the window. At the very least, if they were to have the intellectual courage of their convictions, they would be talking about how many hundreds of billions more over a period of years we would need not to put it on the deficit. Third, and here's the key point, what Graham and McCain are talking about, let's be very clear, is the indefinite occupation of both Afghanistan and Iraq by a substantial number of Americans. When McCain says a few Americans, nonsense. You're not going to send a few Americans into a difficult situation like that. And now we're into Vietnam all over again with a handful of advisors. They will be in the midst of the battle. And so the question is, does America have some obligation or self-interest in permanently maintaining a status quo in both Afghanistan and Iraq that otherwise isn't attainable? And I don't think we do.
And I've been reading report after report that talks about the situation in Iraq, in which it characterizes the Iraqi state as having been constructed in such a way in the wake of the total annihilation that was the 2003 invasion occupation, it could not function in the absence of Americans. And rather than a condemnation of the entire project of Iraq, that is seen as validation of the idea of essentially unending occupation.
Exactly. And by the way, Afghanistan too. You know, in the case of both Iraq and Afghanistan, these are not external powers. You know, I now think that George Bush Sr. was right when we expelled Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. That was a smaller country being invaded by a larger foreign power, and he did that one well. On the other hand, within Iraq and Afghanistan, we are talking about entire civil wars. There is no outside force that's determining this. And I am sorry that one side is losing versus the other, although I must say in Iraq, it's sometimes hard to find the good guys. But the alternative, what they are talking about, is an indefinite American presence at the cost of tens and tens of billions a year. And by the way, one other thing for these great geopolitical people, one of the major losers, if there is this Sunni surge in Iraq that destabilizes it, is Iran. Now, much of the time they are talking about how Iran is our greatest threat.
Right.
Well, Iran is a Shia country, and the Iraqi government of Maliki is the Iranians' ally. So this is, in fact, a much greater loss for Iran, what's going on here, than it is for America. They don't mention that.
Remarkably, if I'm tracking John McCain and Lindsey Graham's ample calls for intervention in various forms and sending of arms, we would be essentially fighting on every side of all conflicts currently happening in the entire region. I mean, they want us essentially involved on all sides of a conflict that has...
I mean, if Iran is your major enemy, you know, Maliki was Iran's great ally. And again, let's go back to this basic point. How do they pay for this? How many? Literally hundreds of billions. And this notion by McCain that this is going to mean more terrorism in the U.S. First of all, we should be very clear about this point. There are terrible people out there who want to kill Americans, and we need to defend ourselves against them. But we can't plug every rat hole in the world. If we shut down Afghanistan, they'll be in Iraq. If they're not in Iraq, they'll be in Yemen. If they're not in Yemen, they'll be in Mali. They'll be in Nigeria. Yes, we can maintain it. I'm for a sensible drone policy to try and deal with them if we find out who they are. But we will be also defending ourselves at home. But if you're worried about Americans dying, if you follow what McCain says, you're going to send Americans back into combat in Iraq, one of the worst examples in American history of a terribly unsuccessful, brutal combat, and you're not going to do it with a handful of people. They're not going to be scared off. So you were talking about many, many more Americans dying, if that is the single biggest thing you're concerned about, than under any other scenario.
Do you think the epic historical nature of the horror and tragedy that was the Iraq War in every direction is understood properly in Washington, having served in Washington during the time, the run-up to the war, during and after the war?
Well, it is by some. It obviously was by the president and the people around him. By the way, among the people I do not hear clamoring for us to go back in are the people who would know best what's involved, the American military. You have, you know, sometimes you'll hear American military people saying, well, we should not reduce in Afghanistan as well. I haven't heard that the American military thinks it's a good idea for them to come back into the Iraq thing. I think the answer is among some of the Republicans, there's not, for two reasons. First of all, whatever President Obama does, they're going to criticize. You know, can I just say one point here, Chris?
Yeah.
For years, many people on both sides have said, we don't want a president unilaterally sending the troops into battle. We don't want a unilateral executive commitment of people into war. They have to go to Congress. The first president to do that was Barack Obama when he said, I think we should bomb Syria because they use chemical weapons, but I won't do that without congressional authorization. Congress said no. He abided by it, which people had been saying presidents should do, and now they attack him for that.
Yeah. Former Congressman Barney Frank, always a pleasure. Thank you. More on that incredible interview between Hillary Clinton and Terry Gross. We will play you a big chunk of it. Stay with us.